So the early stages of the Jesus movement, there were thousands of communes. I know of one group, just one single group in the west coast of the United States, where they had something like 800 communes. And many of the politicians became very interested in those communes. In fact, some of the leading politicians in America at the time became very positive about these young people trying to work out those kind of community living situations. In fact, strangely enough, President Reagan, who then wasn't, of course, the President of the United States, but President Reagan, who at that stage was, I think he may have been the governor of California, he became very, very supportive of a lot of these experiments with communes. What blew it apart was when Jim Jones went crazy and led that terrible slaughter out there in Guyana, where so many of those people living in that weird cult commune were pushed by him to commit mass suicide. So when that happened, it was like the bottom fell out and a very negative feeling swept around the world in terms of the issue of communes and community. But we were born in our movement in that atmosphere of wanting to have communes, of trying to rediscover what church should be, not church as some kind of institution, but church as community, church as people who cared for each other. And not only that, strangely enough, very early on, we became concerned that church ought to be so holistic that it embraced also nature and we, gardening and growing things, not just growing people, but growing gardens and veggies and all those kind of things became part of it as well. Now, in the midst of that, I launched out into the bike scene, which I received a calling for actually prior to meeting some guys that were working amongst bikers in New South Wales, in Australia, in Sydney. And my call to the bikers actually came before that. But some of these guys that were working in the bike scene had heard me speak in public rallies, and they began to attend some of these particular speaking engagements I was speaking at. And two of those were with a group called Youth for Christ, which is a group, of course, that is famous way back for Billy Graham, the evangelist, who was a youth evangelist with Youth for Christ when he first began to preach. And they came to a couple of these conferences where I think we had something like 1,000 young people on the Gold Coast in Queensland who'd come to hear me speak. And out of that, we built a relationship, and it firmed up my sense that God wanted me to do something with bikers. I made a brief trip to America and met some of the hippie Christians over there. And that led me to come back to Australia and not just launch out further into the bike thing, but also to start something we then called Truth and Liberation Concern. And Truth and Liberation Concern was kind of a community of faith very early on. I was a minister's kid, so I'd grown up in the church. I didn't really want to undermine the existing church because I felt there were so many denominations already. This was, of course, before the Pentecostal movement began to start lots and lots of little independent church groups. It was right at the beginning of all that. And I just felt at the time that we needed to gather together and just teach the old book. So I started a Bible study on a Monday night, which grew over the next few years to a huge group of hundreds of people coming every Monday night just to listen to Bible teaching. But we decided that we didn't want to compete with the existing church. We didn't want to sort of start another denomination. But the difficulty was that when we took many of our young people to the local churches, they couldn't fit in. And in fact, I tried to get local churches to take many of these, I suppose you'd call them converts. They were young people that had no Christian background, many of them, and they didn't want to, well, they would have been happy probably to fit in with the local church, but the local church people said, we're middle class people, we wouldn't know how to cope with these kids. And so we decided the best thing to do was to gather together on a Sunday afternoon so we wouldn't be competing with Sunday morning church or night time, because in those days you still had a lot of evening church services, which are not so common these days. But we thought if we had it in the afternoon, it wouldn't be competing. And so we began to meet together, and we, of course, ended up before long, without going into details today, we began to meet together to have communion. That sort of naturally came out of this emerging new church movement, to have communion, to baptize people because they were coming to faith and reading their Bibles and saying, hey, in the Bible they went and got baptized, so do we need to get baptized too? Those Sunday afternoons were mixed with something else that was very much part of the early church, and that was itinerant traveling all around the country telling the message of Jesus. And I've often thought about this, that what we did then was just really a copying of exactly what happened in the early church at the beginning, because Jesus was on the road. And of course we were on our motorcycles, which gave us a bit of a natural bent towards being on the road. And we were doing a lot of work in schools. We were doing youth meetings all over the country. So it was natural for us to be itinerant, to use an old term. Of course, this was a very ancient pattern, not only with Jesus, but if you look at the growth of the early church, you find that St. Paul took to the road with his fellow apostles. And although I don't think enough attention has been given to this, the fact is the early church grew through the apostles and others spreading all over the Roman Empire and taking the message of Jesus wherever they went. That model actually followed on for a long, long time. And even during the period some centuries later, one of the fascinating things we find is that the growth of the church in places like Ireland, Germany, many of the European countries actually expanded exactly the same way. That monks and others travelled on the road. You see pictures sometimes of the monks with their staffs, and they would do two things. They would go and proclaim the message of Jesus, often very much like the Jesus people, like the freaks of the 60s, because they would go and start little communities, and those communities would foster the arts, would foster gardening, all sorts of creative things together. And they would have pilgrims would come and stay there and find faith and be part of those communities of faith. In fact, I think it was St. Columba, there was one of the people that went to Scotland. I think he planted something like 20-something communities of faith there in Scotland, and that spread the message of Jesus throughout that Celtic region of the world at the time. Of course, if you move on a lot later than that and you come to the Methodists, then John Wesley, of course, did something like 300,000 miles on horseback. And when you go to America, Francis Asbury spread the message all over America the same way by travelling on horseback throughout the what we call the outback in Australia, in the United States as well. And during the Civil War and around that period in the United States, another group that we now know as the Churches of Christ did the same thing. They used to put up tents, and both the Methodists and the Church of Christ used to have these rallies, outreach programs where their fiery preachers would go out there and preach the message of Jesus. And that's where the saying, hitting the sawdust trail came from, that they would put sawdust on the ground so that it wouldn't be too dusty, And if you were going to walk out the front when the preacher said, "Do you want to find Jesus?" then you'd walk out on the sawdust to go out the front. So they called it the sawdust trail. And when you follow the Churches of Christ, that's how they grew. Well, what a lot of people don't realise is that when a young man who didn't make it in theological college, William Booth, ended up as a Methodist that was sort of pushed out by the Methodists who were beginning to lose some of their vision for that, he started the Salvation Army. What people don't realise is that he wasn't just famous for caring for prostitutes and the poor. William Booth was also famous for being a travelling preacher. In fact, an intriguing thing is that Booth didn't have motorcycles like we did when we started with God Squad, but the thing that made him famous was that there were trains. They used to go on trains everywhere then, and then the automobile was invented, and he was one of the first preachers to travel all over the land in motor cars, in automobiles, and that kind of was a bit of a surprise to everybody. In the last year of his life, I understand, when he was almost blind, very, very unwell, the dear old man was planning his last world tour to go to America and to go around the world still preaching the message of Jesus. So being on the road and being itinerant, linked with setting up communities of faith and establishing what we call church, but in a more communitarian, more communal kind of way, is a great tradition of the church from way back in its early days.